Alright, what's up everyone? This is going to be a walkthrough for King Arthur's Castle, the Server 2019 practice image. Alright, so a little bit of background. I guess not everyone knows who I am, so quick rundown. I did 6 years of Cyber Patriot, so that equates to around like 5 seasons. I was Open Division All-American, so that's going to nationals all 4 years of high school. 2 of those I was national champion, and I was Windows Officer and RVB Coordinator at Cyber Aegis. So Windows Officer is pretty much just overseeing any Windows operations, presentations, practice images, whatnot. And RVB Coordinator is our nationals prep. RVB stands for Red versus Blue, so anything along those lines, either doing blue teaming, setting up images, or even just red teaming. Those are kind of my tasks. Uh, it's also kind of why I decided to create the practice image. I thought that a lot of people didn't really have access to good images, so I was like, hey, why not? Alright, so a little bit of the thought process that I used when making the image. First and foremost, it's a Cyber Patriot practice image, so the whole goal was to kind of emulate the same ideals that CIAS implements in their images, and kind of test for similar things. Although there are some differences, which I'll talk about later. Uh, Next thing was to implement realistic-ish vulnerabilities in misconfigurations. That's kind of why you didn't see any like media file points or any random forbidden files. Everything was either like persistence or malware. I think it's kind of dumb when you get on a domain controller and you get points for deleting an MP3, like who's storing Playboy Cardi leaks on a DC. Not sure. Another big thing I wanted to do was implement real-world persistence mechanisms in malware. So that's why you saw things like Cobalt Strike, payload templates, fileless malware, userland drivers, and DLLs. A lot of this knowledge was derived from Rostamouse's courses. If you don't know who he is, he does a lot of cybersecurity courses online, and he's pretty active on Twitter too. Oh, of course. Don't mind that. It's the image. So a lot of the knowledge was taken from his courses, just things that I picked up here and there from that. If you're looking to get into one, I'd recommend CRTO. It's pretty good and not too bad. It's cheaper than OSCP and I'd say a little bit more relevant, so good recommendation there. Another big thing about the image was I asked users not to update. Alright. Another thing I did was ask users not to score hotfixes, and the whole point of this was to kind of reward research. If you just install updates, like, yeah, you're technically fixing the vulnerability, but you didn't really know it existed in the first place or how to fix it. So I think by scoring hotfixes, it kind of rewards the research aspect a bit more. So that was kind of the reasoning behind that. Another big thing that people talk about is, oh, like, I gotta script this, I gotta script that, all the top teams got, like, the best scripts. That's partially true. I, for one, tried to script as much as I could, but that's kind of like a anomaly. I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that for everyone. The pros of scripts is that they're really fast, but that's also kind of one of the cons, is that you're 100% going to miss stuff, especially if you don't have like elaborate error handling and error checking in your script. And even if you do, you're probably prone to miss stuff because just human error, you're not going to check over every single error that gets outputted. So it'll cause greater confusion later on. So honestly, if you're at this like stage right now, a couple days before semifinals, I don't think it's worth trying to write like a huge new script. If you have one in the works, I mean, I don't think that's bad. Definitely test it before you use it, but I don't think it's going to be the make or break. So just stick to what you know. Alright, let's get started with forensic questions. A little precursor, I hate these two. I don't really enjoy making them. I think they're kind of random. Sometimes they don't really relate to the image a whole lot. But I tried to make these kind of relevant-ish. So the first one has to do with RDP artifacts. Whole questions right here if you want it. Oh wait, where's the pointer? There we go. Alright, whole questions here if you want it. But the main thing here is it's talking about, due to certain artifacts Windows preserves, we believe you can recover information about what the attacker was doing. So the main thing here is artifacts. It's asking for the command that the attacker ran. And if you do a little research, you'll figure out that there are a lot of event logs for RDP, but none of those will tell you exactly like what someone was doing on an RDP session. The only way to figure that out is by using RDP bitmap caching. So first and foremost, if you just Googled RDP artifacts, you should come up with a link that'll tell you about RDP bitmap caching. By the way, everything I talk about that's underlined is a link, so it'll link off to like a resource or something that I think is helpful, so you can go through and look at those. So you'll figure out about RDP bitmap caching, and it's basically a thing on the client side that's used for, I guess, optimization, so that RDP doesn't have to continuously render the same like, pixels over and over again. That's cool, except that it stores pictures basically in a bin file, and those pictures of the session can be extracted, and then you can piece them together like a puzzle and basically get artifacts from the session. Um, so what you would do is you can use a solution script like this, decode rdp cache.ps1, I've linked to here, and you could supply it with the correct cache file. It actually has the, what is it, location in the script here. Let's open it real quick. So it's located in your app data folder, and then Microsoft Terminal Services, and it's going to be one of these cache files. On the image there were two. Make sure you're using the right one. In this case it was the first cache one, I think the one with 4 zeros. I think the other one might also give you the answer, but just make sure. And you basically just piece the images together until you can see a CMD or PowerShell window, and you can read out the command that's in there. The answer to this was vault cmd/list. I'll talk about this later on, but that's basically just the answer to the first one. Also a little Easter egg here. Alright. The second forensic question had to do with identifying some settings that were changed in Defender, specifically something that had to do with Netcat. And the solution for this one also wasn't too difficult. Honestly, this was supposed to be the easiest forensic question, but I think the wording made it a little confusing to people. The keyword here is properly execute. It's not talking about like bypassing, it's mainly just talking about like compatibility. And one of the things that Defender offers is exploit protection. You can set exploit protection settings for specific binaries. So if you go to like Windows Security, App and Browser Control, exploit protection settings, and then program settings, you can see overrides for like a bunch of different apps. And if you ran a Defender scan, it would flag twain32.exe as a netcat binary, or even just a Malwarebytes scan would probably also flag that. So that's how you could identify that that was a netcat backdoor. And then from there, if you went into the program settings for Defender, you could see that there was an override listed for it. You could also just use the cmdlet get process mitigation and then export it to an XML. And depending on how you did it, either through the GUI or through this export, you would get like one of these 5 answers. They're all kind of related. They have to do with code integrity and the code integrity guard setting. So as long as you got one of these, you should have been awarded points. Alright, let me quickly demo this. So if we go to the image and we open up something like Defender, right here we can go to virus protection settings. Actually, we want to go to app and browser control, and then down here exploit protection settings and program settings, and you scroll all the way down and you'll see that there's one override for twain32.exe. If you click edit and then you scroll down here, you'll see there's an override for code integrity guard. Basically what this is saying is that even if code integrity guard is enabled on the system scale or at a system scale, this application can override that. And depending on the application, that could be an issue. So main point of this forensic question is mainly to just make you aware that settings like this exist and overrides like this are possible, so that you're aware of them. I believe there's also some overrides listed in Stigs that you probably want to look at. But yeah, that was forensic question 2. Alright, the next one has to do with doing some log analysis on your machine, and then doing some file analysis. Truth be told, I screwed up a little on this one. I'll talk about that in a sec. But the first thing was to identify what application was installed. So it tells you in the question that something was installed on the 2nd of January 2023, and it says specifically it was software for file indexing. Now that might already give it away a little if you know what I'm talking about, but you could just run a query against event log specifically for MSI installations. If you don't know what MSI is, it's just kind of like a packaged installer that lets you install apps. A lot of times you'll see this for pretty much any type of application. The installer will usually be like a .exe or a .msi, so just another file format. You can get event logs for it using this command, and it should show you something for the everything tool. Everything is basically just like the forensic question suggests. It's a tool used for file indexing. It does it really fast, so it's really nice. And that's how you get that part. And from there you should be able to tell that the version was this right here, and the maker or the creator of the application was Void Tools. You can also figure out the Void Tools part just by knowing the everything application or like going to their website. The third part of the forensic question was a little tricky. For this one I screwed up a little. Instead of uploading the MSI, which was used on the image, you actually had to upload the exe. Hopefully you figured this out. When you uploaded something to VirusTotal or did some analysis on it, you saw that there weren't really a whole lot of network calls or domain names accessed by the MSI. Yeah, you want to take the executable that you download from the Void Tools website, and then just throw that into VirusTotal, and you can look at the Relations tab, and it'll show you a bunch of different things about the executable, like what IPs it contacts, other things about how the binary is split up. Might be in the Details tab. Let's see. Yeah, things like signers, headers, yeah, sections, stuff like this. But mainly if you go to the Relations tab, you should see it contacts one domain, and that's time.windows.com. And that was the answer for that. I just wanted to make people aware that VirusTotal is pretty powerful, and if you have to do something like file analysis, it can pull apart a binary decently well, and you can learn a lot about it. Alright, let's get into the vulnerabilities, the good. So first thing is user auditing. There's a couple of points here, not too many, but each one kind of had a purpose. The first one was removing unauthorized user Molly McDonald. So the main twist, I guess, with this one was this object was marked as, or prevented you from accidentally deleting it, which basically just means before you delete it, you have to uncheck a check mark in the GUI, and quickly show you the way to do this. So if you open up dsa.msc, or Active Directory Users and Computers, you'll see that there's Slink, Molly McDonald, and Fletcher in the Tough Customers OU. This is pretty much where all the unauthorized users were, so didn't make it too complicated. So if you go to Molly McDonald and you try and delete her, it won't tell you. It'll say you don't have privileges or something, or it's protected from accidental deletion. So you want to go up here to View and then click Advanced Features, and this will show you a lot more. It won't kind of restrict your view. And you'll see that this other T user also pops up, which we'll talk about in a sec. But now if you double click Molly McDonald, and I believe go to Object, you can uncheck this box right here, Protect Object from Accidental Deletion, and then click Apply, OK, and then you should be able to delete this user. And now she's gone. And same thing for T, you can also just delete this now that you actually see it. Oop, I'm dumb and I forgot to uncheck this. Oh yeah, the permissions for this user were changed. So if you go right here in the security, if you go to advanced and you take ownership of this Active Directory object, like give yourself ownership and give yourself full control, then you'll be able to change the permissions. Otherwise it'll just remain grayed out like this. So that was a little twist with those two. Alright, so that's Molly, that's T. Ed's password is not stored using reversible encryption. I mean, reversible encryption is kind of self-explanatory. Not something you really want on a DC. Pretty big vulnerability. So if you go to Ed, who was in users, I believe. Where is that? Yeah, right here. And then you go to account. You'll see right here, store password using reversible encryption. You want to uncheck this one. And then apply and OK. And that should be good for that. Another one, Binky is sensitive and cannot be delegated. So basically, delegating accounts gives them kind of like extra permissions, in a sense. So if you have administrators, or basically like doesn't give them extra permissions. Sorry, it takes their privileges and kind of allocates them someplace else. And the issue with that is if that other place where they're allocated is exploitable or misconfigured in some way, or if someone has access to that, they can then access the, I guess, delegated credentials and that can be an issue, right? Because Binky specifically was a domain admin, I believe. Um, so therefore, attributing credentials can kind of be an issue. So for any domain admins or high privilege accounts, you want to make sure that they're marked as sensitive and cannot be delegated. So same philosophy as Ed. You want to go to Binky right here, and then go to account, and scroll down to right here. Account is sensitive and cannot be delegated, and this right here should give you the points. Alright, the next one has to do with Prunella requires Kerberos pre-auth. So this one has to do with preventing brute forcing. The specific attack that this relates to is called ASREP roasting. You can look into this a bit more, but basically, if you don't enforce pre-auth, then attackers can kind of pull down certain like elements of a user's like password and brute force them with a session key. And that can be a vulnerability, right? If you're using some type of insecure password, then it can be cracked pretty easily. So that's why you want to set that. So same philosophy, if we search for her, go to account, and then I think it's all the way down here. Yeah, you want to uncheck this so that pre-auth is required. It's required by default, but if you check that box, then it becomes a little bit of an issue. The next thing was removing Alan from schema admins. Makes sense. Alan isn't an authorized domain admin, so it doesn't really make sense for him to also have like extended permissions over the Active Directory schema. Bitsy is not a DNS admin. That also makes sense. A specific exploit that relates to this is the server level DLL or plugin DLL. I believe this was on one of the magistrate images. This is basically just where a DNS admin kind of attaches like a plugin in the form of DLL to the DNS service, and then whenever DNS starts, that plugin will also get loaded, and that can allow that user, or pretty much any malicious user, to elevate themselves all the way to system, and then from there they pretty much own your DZ. So you want to make sure that there's not random users in the DNS admins group. Oops. So if you just go to here and then search DNS admins, you'll see members, Bitsy, remove, yeah, and then obviously same thing for schema admins right here. Come here, remove Alan. Arthur, that's our user, so it's fine if it stays in there. But yeah, that's that bit. And then this next one is kind of interesting. So enterprise admins are no longer managed by domain users. So this one might make sense just off the description, but basically if a group is managed by another group, there's also an option to set that allows domain users to modify the membership of the enterprise admin group, and that's obviously an issue, right? Because then anyone in the domain can basically just elevate themselves to enterprise admin, and that's definitely not something that you want. It's a pretty big misconfiguration. So the way you want to resolve this is go to enterprise admin right here, and then if you click managed by, you'll see domain users is set. Now sometimes Active Directory likes to do this. Even when this box was checked initially, sometimes it'll uncheck it on its own. Not sure why it does that, but you want to go ahead and clear this attribute or property, and then apply an OK or just OK, and that should resolve that. Basically makes it so domain users can't update the membership of the enterprise admin group anymore. Just common sense, you know. Next bit was local policies. I'll spend a little bit of time explaining this because I don't think it's too self-explanatory, especially with how overrides work. So policies are set in 3 locations. You have your local security policy, which is secpol.msc. You have group policy management console, gpmc.msc, and then this console has kind of 2 policies by default within it. One is the default domain controller policy, which gets set on every DC in your domain, and the other one is the default domain policy, which gets set on every machine in your domain. And the thing to note here is that anything set in group policy management console will override stuff set in secpol anytime the group policy is synced. That's also why when you open SecPol, you'll see like these two icons. The top one just means, oh, okay, it's like a normal setting, it's set in SecPol. The bottom one indicates that it's controlled at the domain policy level. So that means that whatever setting is listed to the right of here is controlled either in, or is set either in the default domain controller policy or the default domain policy. So what you have to do is look through both of these and see where that policy is set and what the correct value should be. Or you can take the easier route and just unset all the domain policies. This isn't something I'd really recommend doing in an actual like production environment, but if you want a quick and easy fix, this is the best way in my opinion. You can also just import your own group policies, either from like an LGPO export into Group Policy Management Console. I'll show you quickly how to do this. And that, if you set that setting in your local group policy export, that should also override whatever set in GPMC. So let's quickly take a look. So if you open gpmc.msc, you'll see there's two here, like I talked about, under the Group Policy Objects tab. You have the default domain policy for every machine in the domain, and then you got the domain controller's policy. Now, the domain controller's policy on this machine specifically, because this is a DC, it will override the domain policy. So if you have the same setting set in both of these, I believe the domain controller's policy will take precedence over it. But let's talk about how to view the policies real quick. So you just right click and then edit, and then you should be able to see everything. Not preferences, Windows settings, security settings. Just look at like local policies, audit policy. No, I didn't set anything. Security options. Okay, perfect. So like this, for example, LDAP server signing requirements. This is set to no, and we're defining the policy right here. So if we don't want the policy to be set at kind of like the domain level, you can just uncheck this box and then click OK. And that goes for pretty much anything in here. And then you don't really have to do anything to save the settings. You just exit out of here and then run that command in the presentation, gpupdate/force, and this will force your computer to resync or update its policies based on what's set in the domain. So that's how you edit those policies. You can also just import some, like I talked about. So you can import settings or restore from backup. I forget which one actually works. I don't usually do this, but one of those options will let you just import your LGPOs that you've exported normally. So you can do that for that. If you want to just get rid of these policies, like you don't want them, really messing with anything on your computer, you know that you're just gonna go ahead and use your own LGPO export or local security policy export and set it like locally, then you can just come over here to GPO status and then set it to all settings disabled. This is what I personally like to do, just because you're not like modifying anything here. So if you have to go back to something, you can just go to settings right here and like click through and you'll like see what's set. But it's not like screwing with you on your image. So quick and dirty fix. And then obviously you want to run gpupdate/force, and that will I guess sync your computer with the new preferences that you set here to not enforce the GPO. So we can do like cmd and update group policy. Should say something about everything like successfully completed. If it doesn't, and it tells you like, oh, domain was unreachable or domain controller was unreachable, then you probably breaked something in Active Directory, or your firewall is on and blocking it or something. Not sure if firewall would interfere if you're on the same computer, but obviously if you have another computer in the domain and you're trying to do this, then that could definitely be an issue too. So just something to look out for. Alright, so that's how you deal with that. Actually, let me quickly show you guys these two things. So if you open up SecPol, you'll see right now, because we removed the domain policies, everything should just look normal, right? Like you got this like little ones and zeros icon here on the left. But if we close this and then we reapply these, let's see, GP update. if we reapply these and then open secpol, you'll see that some of the icons change and it won't let you change certain policies. Yeah, like all of a sudden some of these are changed and now they're grayed out, right? So this is kind of annoying to deal with if you don't know that you have to edit them here or set them through this window right here. So that's why I prefer to just right click and then set them to disabled, just so that they're out of the way. Alright, for the policy scored on this image, the first one was a secure minimum password length is set. So Stigs says that the minimum password length should be no less than 14, I believe. It might actually be 15 for depending on what Stig you're looking at. But yeah, it was scored for any value from 14 all the way to 20. I don't know why you'd have the minimum password length set to 20. It's kind of extreme, but hey, whatever floats your boat. The next vulnerability was enabling auditing for directory services. So it just gives you greater visibility about what's going on in your domain. If you have something like a SIEM or like an external logging server set up to which you're forwarding logs, which was actually kind of described or alluded to in the competition scenario, like the README, then you could set up like custom rules or alerts that like go off when certain like random parts of LDAP or the Active Directory schema are accessed. That way you know if someone's trying to do like reconnaissance or if someone's trying to do something they're not supposed to. So this is a good policy to set. You should also audit system events. This gives you more insight into what's obviously going on onto your system. Forget what exactly this enables, but I think certain, I guess just connection logs, like I think RDP may fall under this. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, good thing to enable. I don't see why you wouldn't want to enable or audit system events. The next vulnerability, authenticate users or authenticated users cannot add workstations to the domain, relates to the NoPack vulnerability. NoPack was basically a vulnerability where like a standard user, it was a privilege escalation vulnerability where a standard user could create a computer account, name it to like something very similar to the DC, like -1 character, and then basically like request a Kerberos ticket as the DC, I believe. Now I believe this vulnerability applies to the image because obviously the image wasn't updated. But regardless, this isn't something that authenticated users should have the right to do. If you're adding a new computer, I mean, that should be looked over and approved by an admin. I don't see why a standard user would need to do this. So you want to prevent rogue machines and prevent vulnerabilities like NoPack. So that's why you want to set that. And that would obviously be set through user rights assignment. Add workstations to the domain, remove this. Alright. The next vulnerability, domain users cannot enable computer and user accounts to be trusted for delegation. So I talked about delegation beforehand. Basically, you don't want your credentials or some high privileged user to be, I guess, allocated somewhere. And you definitely don't want domain users to just be able to like randomly throw people at certain objects and have their credentials like or permissions like stick there. That's not really something you do. So again, remove domain users from there. That's also in user rights assignment. Everyone no longer has control over vulnerable netlog on secure channel connections relates to the zero logon vulnerability. You should look more into this. This was a pretty big one. It actually allowed someone to get a remote code execution. So pretty big thing. Something to note that this setting pertains to a registry key. If you actually Google zero logon, you should be able to find it. It's like vulnerable channel allow list or something. And this setting or key wasn't actually in effect on this machine. That's because that key only goes into effect like once you update. But the issue with that key currently existing is that when the update does get installed, sorry, and does go into effect, it'll basically grant everyone the ability to create these type of vulnerable connections. And at that point, the zero-day patch is pretty much useless. Well, maybe not entirely useless, but largely useless because, allowing everyone to just create vulnerable connections kind of defeats the purpose of, adding the patch in the first place. This was in registry, so I can show you real quick if I remember, hopefully. I believe local machine, system, current control set, services, and then I believe it was under netlogon. I am blind. Yeah, netlogon, and then parameters. Yeah, this key right here. So if you don't know what this is a SDDL permission. I'll talk about this a bit more later, but basically this gave everyone like access allowed, I believe, or full control, whatever the correct term is. I don't really remember. But yeah, you basically want to get rid of this because that is essentially negating whatever the update was going to do. Ideally, you'd want to set it to something like allowing administrator access. I believe that's what Stigs tells you to do. But main thing I scored for was just making sure that that key either didn't exist currently, so it went to the, I guess, default Microsoft configuration, or that key was set to the correct thing, which was allowing administrators access. The next vulnerability, LDAP server signing requirements require signing, is in security options, and this basically just prevents LDAP communication from being tampered with. Signing typically prevents man-in-the-middle attacks. Not really something you'd have to worry too much about, like in a, I'd say like small production environment, especially in this one because we didn't really have other machines, so kind of hard to get man-in-the-middle from one machine. But definitely something that you want to look at if you're talking about like a big enterprise with a lot of domain controllers all talking to each other and a lot of computers making LDAP requests. Really doesn't hurt to enable signing. The next vulnerability was domain logons are not cached to disk. So this was in security options 2, I believe. Let's try and see. Yep. Number of logons to previously cache in case domain controller not available. The default is 10. There was a script, or no, there was a piece of malware on the image that was setting this to 50. I'll talk about that later on in the presentation. But basically, you want to go ahead and set this to 0 because, in our perfect little world, there shouldn't really be any occasion where the DC isn't available. And if it's not available, then users shouldn't be able to log on because that could indicate that something very bad is going on. The vulnerability with this has to do with exporting the credentials from registry or from the SAN. I think it's just in the registry, and then cracking them offline. These are known as DCC or domain cached creds. You can't pass these, like it's not a passable hash or something, so it's not too much of an issue. But obviously, like I mentioned before, if you have some insecure password, even if it's very long, if it's insecure and on some wordless, it can get cracked. So definitely don't want that. The next vulnerability is to use FIPS compliant algorithms for encryption, hashing, and signing. So this again kind of relates to the signing vulnerability and also tags on encryption and hashing stuff. FIPS is kind of like a government approved set of algorithms and like security standard almost. So you're definitely going to want to enable that. If you don't enable that, you might end up using algorithms that aren't necessarily totally secure or have vulnerabilities in them. So not something that you really want to be dealing with. Alright, the next vulnerability was a virtualized file and registry write failures to per user locations. This is more of kind of like a legacy vulnerability. I don't think it applies too much to machines nowadays, but if you have some old application that's not UAC compliant and it tries to write data to like some public directory, that can be an issue because it may be outputting like sensitive things, like probably not passwords, but maybe like PII, personally identifiable information. So you want to make sure that anything that it's outputting or erroring goes to a user folder or somewhere only that specific user can access. That's also why standard users can't access each other's user folder. It's kind of designed like that. So something you want to enable for old applications. And then the last setting was users cannot can no longer install print drivers, sorry. and this related to Print Nightmare, which is a pretty notorious vulnerability that got released sometime like 2 years ago or so. Uh, the way you fix this is going into devices and then setting the setting prevent users from installing printer drivers enabled. There's no real reason a standard user or anyone really would have to enable a printer driver or install one on a domain controller out of all things. If you are doing printing, it'd probably be from like a workstation or some other server. I really don't know why you'd want to do printing from a DC. Um, you may have domain controlled or domain joined printers, but you shouldn't be installing the drivers for those printers on the DC and printing from the DC itself. Alright, the next category is defensive countermeasures, so this pertains to anything really Defender related. Um, so the first thing was fixing Defender. So what I did was I messed with the permissions on the folder, specifically I believe in program files. I screwed around with the permissions a little, who owned what, and I think a little bit in registry too. And eventually this somehow resulted in any Defender commands that you ran through like PowerShell just erroring out. Like, I don't know, we got like some cryptid stuff over here. Uh, no idea how we ended up with this, but I guess we can call it a feature of the image. Truth be told, I'm not even sure how to fix this. I didn't plan on it being like an issue. But the good thing was all this was avoidable. So yeah, pretty much anytime you set something through the GUI or use commands, it sets it in the Software Microsoft Windows Defender registry key. I don't know if the GUI also errored out when you try to set things, but it may have. I know if you definitely try to set things manually in registry, like in this location, you got errors. Or if you try to use PowerShell commands, you definitely got errors like this. I got some Playboy Cardi speak right here. But there's a really easy way around this, and this is, again, has to do with overrides. So if you set settings through GPOs, they'll get configured here in the HKLM Software Policies Microsoft key, and then Windows Defender, blah blah blah, whatever. So if you set settings in the policy key, it should override anything that's set in this key right here. So basically, the easiest way around this, instead of trying to spend like 5 hours fixing Defender and fixing all the permissions, you could just set everything in the policies key, like through GPOs or just manually adding registry entries in the policies key, and that would have been totally fine. It's also a better way of doing it, because that way it's kind of like more system-wide, more official, harder to change. Standard users can't really mess with it, things like that. Alright, the first vulnerability was making sure Defender no longer runs in passive mode. So if you go to this registry path, and then Windows Advanced Threat Protection, you would have seen a key that says Force Defender Passive Mode, and I believe it was set to 1. This is conventionally set by third-party antiviruses to ensure that certain parts of Defender or scanning features don't interfere with whatever third-party antivirus set this key. So mainly like a compatibility thing for other AVs, but since there was no other AV and the README didn't talk about it, this is something that you definitely don't want set, because it kind of like neuters parts of Defender, and you know, if you want to defend your system, you gotta have the whole thing working. So you want to go ahead and delete this key or set it to 0, and that's how you fix that. The next thing has to do with Defender network protection. So I've linked a little something here for you guys to read. But basically this prevents users from accessing like known malicious sites. It's not amazing, I'm not gonna lie. I've never seen it actually work, but I also haven't really dived deep into it and tried to get it to work, or tried to like flag it. But in theory, it prevents users from accessing known malicious sites. Something like this can also be set in like Firefox or Google Chrome itself, but this is kind of like Windows or like Microsoft's take on it. The next vulnerability had to do with making sure high severity threats, or actually this should be severe severity threats, are no longer ignored. So if you look at this thing that I've linked here, this is actually a GPO, and you'll see that the registry entries are right here, and you'll see that number 5 right here, severe, corresponds, or 5 corresponds with severe. So you'll see a registry key with the number 5. and then its value on the image would have been 6, which signifies ignore. So things like the netcat backdoor that was alluded to in Friends of Question 2 would have been like found but ignored by Defender, and that's obviously an issue, right? If you have a Defender running, you're under the impression that it's actually doing something, but if everything is just ignored, then it's kind of useless. So definitely something that you want to remove. I think for this one, I believe you should have either deleted it or set the default behavior to just not be ignore. Most likely you want it to just straight up remove, so the value should have been 3. Alright. The next vulnerability was making sure Defender attack surface reduction rules block executables in accordance with cloud-based protection. So kind of a long one, but if you don't know what ASR rules are, basically kind of like extended capabilities for Defender. There's a lot here, and yeah, you'll see there's a lot here, and it even tells you like what version it works on, whatnot. Trying to find, yeah, here are the GUIDs that actually relate to the rules. So you're basically going to want to set these in group policy because obviously the Defender commands are kind of busted. So there's the cmdlet for that if you do use PowerShell, but there's also group policy that relates to it, and that's what you'd want to set. Basically, this ASR rule blocked executables unless they met like certain requirements, and those requirements were dictated by the cloud protection. Cloud protection is actually the next vulnerability. I wanted to score these two together, but because of how ACUS does its vulnerability logic, I couldn't. So I just decided to split them up and make them each 1 point. So yeah, that was that one. Just setting this, setting this GUID attack surface rule, and then setting it to 1 so that it actually blocks, not just auditing. If you set it to 2, then I believe it's on audit only mode. So you want to make sure it's on 1. Definitely not 0 for disabled. Alright, yeah, so as I alluded to, next vulnerability, just enabling cloud protection. This is needed for the above rule to work, otherwise it kind of doesn't really do anything. Defender Cloud Protection is just Microsoft's kind of like eye in the sky service for figuring out like new malware and new threats. So you can enable it with this command, or you can also just set it through registry. Both work. Alright. The next vulnerability had to again do with attack surface reduction rules. So if you didn't know, you can actually add exclusions specifically for ASR rules. It's not something that shows up in the GUI, which is why I wanted to score it, because not a lot of people know about it, since, even if they did explore the GUI, they probably would have missed it. So you can look at it using the get-np preference command, and then you look for the attack surface reduction only exclusions. Since the commands didn't exactly work on the image, because permissions with Defender were kind of screwed, you can just go ahead and go to the registry at the location I talked about before, this one right here, and then you should see the value stored in there somewhere, and you can just edit the permissions like manually and delete the key, and that should give you the points for the vulnerability. And the last offensive countermeasure was making sure that Google Chrome cannot override DEP. So this kind of related to, I believe, the second forensic question, the one where it's asking about, what override or what Defender setting was tweaked to allow Netcat to run. So hopefully that got you kind of thinking a little, and you saw that Google Chrome was actually allowed to override the computer's DEP policy. So same process, you want to go to Windows Security, app and browser control, and then exploit protection settings, program settings, and you'll see that chrome.exe is there, and just make sure that DEP is enabled for it. So real quick, we can look at that. Go to app and browser control, right here, program settings, you'll see Chrome, there's one override. If you click edit, you'll see that we're currently overriding the system policy, and we're making sure that DEP is off. Now, this is kind of a bad thing, especially because Stigs actually recommends that you set it to the opposite, and make sure that Chrome cannot override DEP. So yeah, just something to look at. Let's quickly go over the Defender bit I was talking about. Let me show you what it looks like in registry. Let me get the key real quick. Software, Microsoft Windows Defender. Alright. So if we go to software, Microsoft Windows Defender, you'll see down here there's a lot of things. But if we go to, where is it? Is it threats? No, it's not threats. Yeah, here, ASR, and then ASR only exclusions, you'll see that System32 was excluded. So if you change the permissions on this key and then deleted it, that should have given you the points. Alright, the next couple settings were uncategorized operating system settings. So these are just things that don't really fit into a category, just miscellaneous, kind of obscure things. But I tried to make them as relevant as I could. So the first one is make sure that everyone is no longer allowed full control to the sysvol share. So the way you ensure this is by going to computer management, share, sysvol, look at the share permissions, and just make sure that everyone can only read. Sysvol is an important share used in Active Directory operations, and if anyone or if any like standard user can kind of edit the share and just add in their own things, then you can get issues with things like replication or even just like having some low privileged user like distributing malware across your network, which is pretty bad. So you definitely want to make sure that that's fixed. So we can look at that real quick. Let me close out of all of this. So if you go to computer management and then shares right here, sysvol, right click properties, share permissions, you'll see that everyone is granted full control. You just want to uncheck this and uncheck change and make sure that they only have read permissions. Yeah. The next vulnerability is domain users can no longer read ntds.dit. So this is a pretty critical file. It's where the hashes of a lot of Active Directory users get stored. This can be pretty much copied from like a volume shadow copy or something, or a backup of some sort, and then hashes can be cracked offline. So it doesn't pose a direct risk in the sense that like, like it's clear text or something, but obviously if there's any insecure password, then that can be a really big issue. So the way you want to fix this is browse to this file, go to property security, and then delete domain users. They shouldn't have any permissions on this file, I believe. So we can do that real quick. Yeah. So Windows and then ntds, I believe, and ntds.dit. You'll notice if you try and delete it or something, it'll tell you it's open. So that also prevents people from just like straight up making copies of it. So the only way to really like grab hashes out of this is to take some type of like system backup and then grab it off of that. But to fix this vulnerability, you want to go to properties, security, and then you'll see that there's domain users right here. You want to make sure that they can't read. So let's go to right here and then remove domain users. And yeah, that should be good. So the main thing here is just making sure that critical parts of Active Directory don't have random permissions on them that are giving like users extended capabilities. This is really a like common misconfiguration or type of misconfiguration that you see in Active Directory, like users granted random rights in one place that gives them rights to some other place, and then eventually you daisy chain enough of those together and you could have a path for users to get all the way up to domain admin. So it's things like this that compromise like big company networks. The next vulnerability was making sure that the default PowerShell script double-click behavior was not set to execute. So if you didn't know, a lot of the times when you double-click files on Windows, they'll do like some operation like, oh, you double-click a text file and it'll open a notepad, right? And that's what you want to happen for PowerShell scripts. But you can also change it so that when you double click it executes. The issue with this is if someone runs like a really crappy like phishing campaign, let's say, and they manage to get some like I guess clueless user to download like their PowerShell script and then double click and execute it, then you pretty much just pwned your entire domain. But if you make it a little more difficult for people to accidentally do stuff, or like you make it so people are more aware of what they're doing, like they have to open up PowerShell and run it, then you can kind of protect it against some of those like really simple like low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities or exploits. So the way to do this was to go into HKey class root. Might be new for some of you guys. It's not really a registry path that's commonly, I guess, explored. But you want to go into HKey class root and then Microsoft.PowerShell script shell, and then there's a default value, and you want to make sure that it's not set to 0. Um, there's two values that you can set it to, or that would be fine, which would be open and edit. Open spawns it in kind of like a notepad editor, and then edit just spawns it in a PowerShell ISE window. So let's take a look at this real quick. So if we open up registry, and then we go to HKey class root, and it's going to be, I believe, Microsoft, yeah, PowerShell script. So let's go here, Microsoft PowerShell script. You'll see that there's a lot, so basically any file extension or anything shows up here. Microsoft PowerShell script. I'm dumb. Alright, here we go. And right here under shell, you'll see that the default action is 0. Now you're probably thinking, okay, like 0 is cool, but what does it mean? If you click the drop down, you'll see that there's a corresponding key named 0, and then you can see that it basically executes PowerShell and tells PowerShell to run whatever that file is. Now if you change it to something like open, oops, sorry, yeah, here's the command part. So this will basically, whenever you double click a PowerShell file or .ps1, it will execute it with these arguments. Let's look at this real quick. Something scope bypass, whatnot, right? But if you set it to open, the default action, where is it? Yeah, if you set this default value to open, then what it'll do is it'll just spawn Notepad and tell Notepad to open whatever file, instead of just directly running it. And that's a lot safer and won't cause like accidental misconfigurations. So just a little thing to look out for. The next vulnerability was making sure that deprecated triple DES algorithms aren't used in Windows, specifically S-channel. S-channel is kind of the thing, or like, I guess, algorithm provider in Windows. It dictates, or you can make it dictate what algorithms Windows is using, like what protocols. Things like different versions of SSL or like TLS. And you want to make sure that it's not using triple DES. This one is kind of more of a theoretical vulnerability, and that's partly due to the fact that triple DES is, I believe, only vulnerable like in theory. You can read about it here. There's probably some crypto jargon that I'm not explaining right. Deny. But basically, something. If you encrypt to, where is it? Yeah, something about if you encrypt like large bits of data together in like XRM, there's a chance you could get like repeating like ciphertext. Yeah, I haven't actually seen anyone exploit this. Then again, this is 2017, so very possible that it has been exploited. Probably gonna get roasted for not explaining that right, but basically, large amounts of data like merged together could produce duplicate ciphertext blocks, and that can be an issue, right? Because then certain things can be decoded. Definitely not something that you want. I think if you also run a Nessus scan, Nessus is pretty garbage, so I actually wouldn't recommend ever using Nessus. But if you do ever delve in the realm of Nessus and you run like a scan against like a domain controller, I think like half of the alerts or like vulnerability findings that it gives you are just issues with triple DES. So yeah, just something to look at and fix. So the way you fix it is just by going to the registry path, creating a little value called enabled, and then setting it to 0. So basically disabling it. The next vulnerability was making sure NetBIOS over TCP was disabled. The path for this is this long thing right here. This bit here is unique to each image and network adapter. So for how many of our network adapters you have, you'll have like multiple of these like registry keys right here. But you want to create a key called NetBIOS options and set it to 2. I think this key might actually exist by default. this NetBIOS options value. It might actually exist by default, but you want to set it to 2, and that'll make it so NetBIOS can't be used over TCP. The reason we want to set this is because NetBIOS is kind of old and unnecessary, and it's often just abused by red team for things like enumeration or spoofing. So not really something you need in like a big production environment, especially if all the machines are newer. You definitely don't need it to be doing NetBIOS stuff. And then the next vulnerability was making sure that system failures do not cause automatic memory dumps. So this is actually a pretty cool one. I haven't actually seen this in a benchmark or any type of like security guide. Actually, maybe one place. But what this does is it prevents potentially sensitive information from being dumped into random like DMP files if the system crashes or shuts down. And this could be an issue if you have some type of like cruddy or like really badly coded application, and all of a sudden your system like BSODs, all that information could get dumped from the memory into like a file, and then an attacker could like basically scour your system for like a memory dump, and then analyze it, maybe find like remnants of like credentials like stuck in memory or something that were dumped to the file. I believe it's the same concept as core dumps on Linux. Don't quote me on that, I don't really do Linux, but I believe it is like the same type of principle. So this is the registry key for it. If you want to set it through the GUI, it's not too hard. It's actually easier. If you open up Control Panel, then go to System and Security, System, then Advanced System Settings, down here, under Startup and Recovery, go to Settings, and then make sure this is set to None. That way you're not just dumping random information whenever Windows crashes. Alright. Services. So the first vulnerability had to do with Dimension 4. Dimension 4 is just an application that syncs your time with like a third-party time server. So the Windows time service is fine, but it's not really like dead accurate to the second, at least when I've used it. So Dimension 4 can be used like as an alternative, not really known or anything, just like a small niche app. The main reason I included it is because by default it's vulnerable to privilege escalation. There's a vulnerability called the unquoted like image path or whatever. You can read about it here, I linked it. But basically, because of the way Windows reads file paths that have a space in them, you can like trick the service into running a binary other than the actual service binary. And the issue with this, right, is now you have some random binary that gets run, like as system or something. Funny enough, this is actually Windows's like intended behavior. That's why it hasn't really been patched or whatever, like with the update or something. Just weird. I don't know. Their, I guess their recommendation is just to like stick some quotes around it or whatever, around the image path to fix a vulnerability. So that's basically what you do. You just go into registry and look at the image path and put quotes around it. So real quick we can do that. Let's go back to registry for like the 10th time. And let's go to where all the services are. Local machine, system, control set, services, and then look for Dimension 4. Where are you at? Alright, right here, image path. You see we got it in C, program files, x86, D4, right? And the issue here is that right here, there's a space. And that means that you can stick a binary in here. I think it's actually talked about. I close the link. It's talked about here. You can stick a binary like program files or whatever, or like program.exe or something, and that will get run instead of the actual like D4 binary. So that's an issue. So to fix this, you just come over here, put some quotes so that Windows knows we only want this binary to run, and then that's fixed. Alright. The next vulnerability is a little interesting. This one I actually spent a little time on, so I kind of like this one. It's hidden malicious Cobalt Strike service payload deleted. So the display name for this one was Windows push notification user service underscore blah 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 whatever, right? This is a legit-ish display name. If you look on your host or like any other Windows 10 machine, you'll see a service that actually looks a lot like this, just that the last characters will be like kind of replaced. But the tricky thing with this was that it was hidden with SDDL perms, so you won't be able to find it using PowerShell, and it won't show up in the GUI either. So if we look real quick, so let's look at services. Let's go all the way down here. What was it called? Windows push notification. Alright, yeah, so let's go down here. Windows push. Yeah, you'll see this one, but this isn't the right service. And you'll see if I refresh, still not here. But if we go all the way down here, you'll see that it does exist. And it does have a display name, and it also has a description, and it's running a binary. And the way you do this basically is through SDDL perms. This is basically like a way you can set like permissions on services or like different things within Windows. This is a SANS article about red teaming, which is pretty cool. It's where I originally found the idea. But yeah, this guy kind of walks you through it. I highly recommend reading it. But at the end, there's also a little command here to unhide it, I believe. Yeah. So you can run this, and it should make the service appear in the GUI. You didn't actually need to do that. You could have just gone right here and then, deleted the service. But yeah, that's basically how you're supposed to find out, oh, that this thing is malicious, by seeing that there's this random service in the registry that doesn't show up in the GUI. Then you could do some analysis on this binary here, and if you put it into VirusTotal, I think it like flags like 21 out of the 60 something AVs, which is kind of terrible. But I tried. You can see right here on my Kali that it does actually work. It actively responds and everything. So let's set the sleep to like 3. Come on, check in. There we go. Okay, so we can do something like shell's a command, right? Yeah, shell who am I, and it'll get back to us. Yeah, we're system. We can, I think, message all users like hi or something, right? And unknown command. Oh, I'm dumb. Yeah, we can message all users hi or something. It'll execute. We go back to the image. Bam, it's running, right? So it was actually functional. So that was kind of like the little cool bit. Yeah, I used a bit of evasion in it just so that it wouldn't get like instant purged by Defender. Obviously, it's not amazing, but it does work. Oh, that's not even the right service. I'm dumb. Let's go ahead and unhide it real quick. Then replace the name with what it actually is. Yeah. Alright. Come all the way over here. Alright. Now, if we refresh, bam, we see this random little thing pop up, right? And you'll see it looks kind of legit-ish. But obviously, you upload the exe to VirusTotal, flags like 20, 30 things. It's like, oh, game over, right? So that's how you figure out that one. To get the points, you pretty much just want to come over here and delete this registry key and delete the binary. Don't forget to do that. Alright. Yeah, I made this with the barebones service template, so this is the template thing I was talking about. Honestly, I don't know anything about C# or C or C++, so I had no idea what I was doing. I just stuck some random like virtual alloc execute or something right in here in main, and it worked. So actually, not there in its service. That's where I put it. Yeah. All right. And then the last vulnerability had to do with fixing Windows Defender Firewall. This one was one of the vulnerabilities that kind of like came and went constantly, so that's why you got spammed with noises on the image. The way I screwed with this was just changing the user that runs the service, and then I removed some of the user rights. So let's take a look at that real quick. So I believe it starts with the M. That's the wrong direction. So where are the M services? Here. Where is it? I'm blind. Oh, here. Yeah. Alright. If you go to, I think right here is fine. Think object name? Yeah, I think I messed with this. And I think I also messed with the required privileges. You'll see if you go to your host, there should be like 6 here. I deleted like 2 or 3 of them. Um, so yeah, if you just add those back, it should just start normally. You'll see over here, if you go to the firewall service, where is it? Yeah, Windows Defender Firewall. If you go right here, you'll see it tries like repeatedly to start itself, and that's why you get the points like momentarily, because it starts for like half a second and then like instantly dies. Um, so yeah, to fix it, you just want to fix these privileges and make sure that the user running it is the correct one. The easiest way to do this is actually to just go on your host or like a clean image, right click and then like export. You can just do this desktop like firewall. Yeah. And then now we have a little something that has, all the registry values in it. Like let's pretend this is from like a clean image on my host. Then, you can just like import this or merge it into registry and all this should be fixed. And that's pretty much like the quickest and easiest way to fix that. Alright, the next group of vulnerabilities had to do with application updates. Obviously, Google Chrome was the default browser on this machine, so make sure that it's updated. If you tried to update through the app, you would have gotten an error. The reason for this was because I renamed the actual binary that does updates for Google Chrome. So you either had to rename that binary to be like the correct thing, or just reinstall or rerun the updater, like the installer from the website, and that would have gotten you points. Notepad++ has been updated. Not gonna lie, I kind of goofed on this one too. I forgot to put it in the README, but luckily it wasn't really an important vulnerability, so it didn't really matter if you got it or not. Alright, features. There was only one feature scored. PowerShell 2.0 has been uninstalled. Now, this may confuse some people, like, oh, like, why do I want to uninstall PowerShell? And the main thing here is that it's PowerShell 2.0. It's really old, and it's kind of a security vulnerability because it's old. It doesn't have modern features like logging or things like AMSI, which I'll talk about later. Um, so a lot of red teamers like to use this because they can't really be traced, and it doesn't really have the defensive capabilities of like PowerShell 5 or like PowerShell 7. So something that you want to uninstall as a blue teamer. Also, if you're blue teaming, I don't understand why you'd want PowerShell 2.0. Like, it's just worse. Doesn't make anything easier, and you're never gonna use it. So, yeah, just make your life easier and make the red teams harder. Remove this. All right, malware and forbidden files. This is also where I spent like kind of like the bulk of my time, just making sure that things worked and whatnot. So the first one was removing a malicious AMSI provider. Basically, AMSI stands for Anti-Malware Scan Interface, and it's essentially like an AV for PowerShell in-process stuff. Um, Technically, it's for anything .NET related. It'll scan like .NET stuff that's running in memory, because PowerShell is based on .NET. Also scans PowerShell stuff. So that's why things like PowerShell web shells like will get caught now, or like you can't use like Mimikatz in PowerShell anymore because it'll get caught. Stuff like that. That's because of AMSI. Defender has its own AMSI provider or whatever that it uses to like scan all commands. But you can also make your own. I guess that's cool. Thank you, Microsoft. And they literally tell you how. They also give you the code to make it. Uh, yeah, I don't know. That's kind of funny to me. So basically, if I'm Mr. Red Team Man, I can just take this code, stick my little Cobalt Strike beacon somewhere in here, and every time you run PowerShell or like some .NET application, this DLL right here, this one that I made, will get loaded in. I didn't actually make it really do anything malicious, partially because I got lazy and I didn't want to recompile. Um, but it was located in the Defender folder, changed the date, modified and everything so it blended in a little bit better. And then I registered it using this command just without the /u. And it creates a couple of registry keys and whatnot. So yeah, if you want to remove it, all you really have to do, delete the file, or unregister it first, delete the file, and then you're good to go, because the registry keys that it creates to like make it so it hooks into PowerShell or whatnot get deleted, and then you can just delete the file. So pretty much as easy as that. If you're wondering like, oh, how do I know which AMSI providers are like currently like used or like what's on my system? At the bottom of this article here, you'll see if you go to AMSI providers here, it'll actually like list them out. Let's quickly go on the image. Let me try and show you guys. Right here, yeah. And you see there's this random one, like dead. That definitely does not seem legit. It's also literally called fake AMSI. That's kind of funny. So then if you go to, let's see what's a good one. If you go to like this path, this is where some of the other information is stored. You'll see dead pops up, first one. And then right here, you'll see it's loading this DLL. And that's how you know that, oh, like that's a malicious file it's running, like this is bad. Yeah, that's how you identify it. You can also identify AMSI providers by using seatbelt. If you did some type of like analysis on the image, you would have seen that before I released it, I ran the seatbelt executable. Let me quickly show you guys what seatbelt is. Not that. Yeah, seatbelt. Basically just a tool that like enumerates a lot of like Windows information. First one right here, AMSI providers. If you use this, you can list like what the AMSI providers on your image are, and you can see if there's any like random malicious ones, and if there are, then you do that little bit of forensic analysis like I showed you. You go through registry, you find the ID, you find the DLL, and you unregister it like I showed you guys. Alright, the next vulnerability has to do with a driver actually. This one was the supposedly tricky one. AMSI actually ended up being the harder vulnerability. I don't know why I thought that WinDivert or WinDivert would be harder, but yeah, whatever. This driver was actually used to divert traffic from one port to another, and it relates to NTLM like relaying. So since NTLM authentication happens over port 445, and 445 is the SMB port and can't be unbound, you pretty much need a driver to intercept the traffic and then redirect it somewhere else and then forward it back to your team server, blah blah blah, a lot of stuff, right? This is what the actual diagram looks like. Yeah, it's kind of nutty. Definitely not like very intuitive, but yeah, Origin is like one of your machines, right? You divert, or you have Origin connect to whatever machine your beacon is on. It intercepts the traffic on 445, reverse port forward on 8445, send it back to team server, relay to SOCKS, then to this SOCKS, then eventually to the target, right? A lot of stuff. Basically, all you need to know is that it's taking the traffic from 445 and diverting it somewhere else so that it can be forwarded, right? And another issue with doing this is that it'll break all like SMB functionality. So definitely not something that you want, and kind of dangerous. So it was located in the System32 drivers folder, as pretty much any other driver, and it was signed by some random entity, like some random, I don't even know. So the easiest way to find this is to verify that your drivers are actually signed by Microsoft or some, like reliable entity. So you could use tools like SIGVerif or driverquery.exe, or even like SIGCheck, I believe, from System Journals, and actually see like who's signing your drivers. And you would have seen that some random dude from some random country, had signed this driver. Definitely wasn't Microsoft, and that's how you kind of like would have raised, the alert level, or like would have began to become suspicious. And then you can look into it more, like upload it to VirusTotal. This one actually didn't really flag on VirusTotal, but if you just Googled it, you would have found, oh, okay, it like redirects traffic. And yeah, you could have removed it from there. So, not too complicated. Alright, the next vulnerability had to do with WMI persistence. Alright, so WMI persistence is basically fileless malware, I guess you can think of it. Persistence in general is just any mechanism on the machine that will allow an attacker to repeatedly gain access or get in. So like if you reboot the machine, you know, persistence will like rerun the payload, allow the attacker to get back in. That's what persistence is. WMI is kind of like a little like internal part of Windows. WMI persistence abuses kind of like a little scheduling functionality in WMI, and makes it so you can run a payload like depending on whether or not like a query is satisfied. So you can use the sysinternals autoruns program to actually find this, and then autoruns will remove one of the three components here. So let's download autoruns real quick. Let's use the live one. Yeah. Agree to this. And then if we let it load, where is it? You can also just go to WMI right here, and you'll see there's something here. And I don't know what it says. Is in other versions it says Twitter because that's what I named the thing. Oh yeah, right here, Twitter. This is the thing that was popping up my Twitter handle on the screen when you boot it up. So yeah, you can see the query right here, and it's basically, so WMI is basically just kind of like uses like a database type querying system. So this little backdoor or piece of persistence was designed to run within like 60 seconds or so of system boot, or actually between where is it, like 240 seconds, and it's cut off, but it should say 325. So yeah, between those seconds of like the system boot, it should execute that little like Twitter pop-up. I didn't actually make it really do anything, partially because I ran out of ideas and I didn't want to screw with people too hard. But yeah, that's just something that you can do. You can make it execute pretty much anything you want. Really nifty, and you can find it really easily with just auto runs. You know, by default, I believe there's only like one other WMI like subscription is what they call them. So, but in auto runs it should filter that one out. So if you do see one, then you know it's most likely malicious. And the way you actually find all three parts is by using this command. You can also just Google more on WMI persistence and you'll find a bunch of commands. But these are the three that you need. So you basically just get -WMI object and -class whatever, right? You have the event filter, the event consumer, and then the filter to consumer binding. So the filter is basically just this query right here. This one. It just dictates like when this bit of persistence is run or executed. The consumer is the actual like payload element of it. It determines like, okay, what binary is being run. So in this case, it was PowerShell, and it was being run with like the arguments of like message star like, and then the Twitter handle or whatever, right? So this is what's actually running the payload, I believe. Yeah. And then this last one basically just links these two together. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's like the rope that like ties them together. So there's three parts, and autoruns, unfortunately, if you delete it from here, it'll only delete like one of the parts. Oh great, we have to run as admin. Yes. Alright, let's go to WMI. It'll only delete one of the... Huh? Oh, okay. It'll only delete one of the parts. So you see that's gone. No more WMI, but if we run these commands, it should pop up. Oops. Let me grab these three. That's not the whole command. There we go. Alright. Can my image come back? Okay, never seen that before. I swear it wasn't supposed to do that. No idea why that happened. Let's fix this real quick. VMware Tools might have nuked itself, no idea. Okay. Let's open up PowerShell real quick and then not run it. Oops. Come on. I think VMware Tools nuked itself. Nice. Let me try and copy again. Also, I feel like I missed a vulnerability. Did I? Should have been here somewhere. Uncategorized. Let me look for a sec. Alright, yes. Sorry about that. I forgot to include one of the vulnerabilities for local policy. Basically just run as different user, context menu removed from start window. This just makes it so when you try and do something, like PowerShell for example, you can't right click and then run as different user. The issue with this is that, you know, if I'm like some red team, I guess actor or whatever, I could potentially frame another user for my actions, and that makes log analysis and like hunting me down a lot more difficult, because I can blend in with like other users, and you know, it just puts blame on other people, so definitely not something that you want. Sorry about that. Back to, where was I? Yeah, back to doubling my persistence. So thank you to VMware for just nuking itself. But if you do run these commands on the images, it should show you a bunch of results. They should all be named like Twitter. It should have the name Twitter in them. So if you want to remove that, you basically just take these commands and then you append a dash filter, and you replace this part with Twitter, or whatever name you find, and then pipe it into remove WMI object, and oops, that should remove any like remnants of persistence and whatnot. Please, Google Slides. It loves me today. Come on. Alright, we'll just move on with that presenter mode. Alright. So the next bit is the netsh helper DLL persistence bit. So I linked the MITRE ATT&CK explanation here. Maybe it's my Wi-Fi. But basically, this is another type of persistence that specifically deals with netsh. So netsh, you know, is just the little binary that lets you control like elements of the firewall. And netsh helper DLLs are basically loaded in whenever netsh is executed. And you know, of course, you can add in your own DLL. Okay, I think it's loading. Yeah, you can add in your own DLL. So in this point, or in this case, it was named like flashpoint.dll. And you know, the DLL can execute whatever you want. I think this DLL, I made it execute, or I made it change the number of cached logons to 50. So if you kept losing that point, that's probably why, because you were running something with netsh and it was calling this DLL, which was doing that. So the way to find this is just to look in HKLM, Software Microsoft, and then netsh, and then you can diff the names with like something from a default image, and you should have seen that this one stood out. And the DLL will also be listed there, and you can just go ahead and delete both those entries and should be able to remove the persistence. Yeah, okay, MITRE finally loaded. So basically it'll tell you the same thing. It'll give you a lot of cool like little detection things, examples, whatnot, you know, your official documentation stuff. Alright, on the image, what this looks like is, let's go into registry, of course, the mini screen. Let me close this off. Then let's see where it is. With local machine, and then Software Microsoft netsh. Alright. here, software, Microsoft, NetSH. Alright, perfect. And you'll see here, flashpoint.dll. It doesn't actually give you the full path, but if you like use everything or Windows File Explorer to look where these other DLLs are, it's in the same folder, just named this. So you just get rid of both those things and you should get the points. Alright, maybe full screen now. There we go. Alright, the next vulnerability has to do with alternate data streams. So if you're not familiar with what this is, actually, oops, let me fix this real quick. It wasn't a PowerShell payload, it was just PII. There we go. Alright, so if you're not familiar with alternate data streams, basically it's kind of like a feature of the NTFS file system. So in Windows you conventionally have two file systems. You have FAT and then you have NTFS. So the way FAT works is you got your like name.extension file or whatever, right? Like I don't know, like test.txt or something. It's got some attributes, some metadata stuff, and it's got like data. In NTFS, you have your file, right? Like name.extension or like test.exe or whatever. It has attributes, it has security things on it like permissions. And then you've got different streams of data. So think of it kind of like the mouth of a river, right? And you got like multiple rivers flowing in. By default, you only have one stream, which is like the main stream. It's actually called like $data. But you can create separate streams and store data within those streams and kind of like link them to the same file. So they're not really like readily visible. Like if you look in File Explorer, you won't see the other streams. In fact, the file size doesn't even change because the file size is being, I believe, read from the main data stream. But if you use some type of third-party tool, or you use this command right here, like dir/r, and specifically on the C Windows folder, you can find that there is a random data stream attached to it. So in this case, it was pretty sure I can run it real quick, but may not show in CMD. Let's see. Right here, we can do dir/rc : Windows. Should be like one of the first things that shows up. Yeah. So the characters don't exactly display, but I believe if you copy this into like Chrome or something, yeah, it's just a bunch of Chinese characters. Put this into Google Translate. Yeah, Rickroll, classic, right? And this data stream, you might be a little confused. Well, we talked about like data streams being attached to files, but this is a folder, right? So like, where's the file? That's one of the beauties of ADS. It's that you can attach it to pretty much anything you want, one of those being a folder. So in this case, it was attached to the Windows folder. And this makes it a little bit more complicated, right? Like you can't really, like, if you Google like how to read data from alternate data streams or whatever, you might find some PowerShell commands or whatever, some third-party utilities, but because it's on the directory, it makes it a little bit harder to read. So you can probably figure out how to do that. Don't think it'll be too complicated. But the main thing here is, if it's named, if it's Rickrolling you, it's probably not default. So you can go ahead and remove it. And the way I recommend doing it is using the streams executable from sysinternals. So right here, and you can use the streams-d command and then give it a folder, and it'll delete any alternate data streams on that folder. You can also specify like -s, yeah, to do it recursively and delete everything off of any like subdirectories. I wouldn't do that on the C like Windows folder. There might be some alternate data streams that are like needed for Windows to actually function properly. I think Notepad especially is like one of the Windows binaries that uses that type of functionality. So yeah, definitely don't just throw this around, but if you only see like one streaMiner directory and you know it's malicious or not default, you can go ahead and delete it with the -d parameter. Alright. The next vuln is removing credentials stored in the credential manager DPAPI. It's DP API, right? It stands for like Data Protection API, but we like to call it DPAPI. So the answer to FQ1 actually hinted at this. If you run vault-cmd/list, it'll show credentials like saved in Windows. So if we go into the image real quick and we do like vault, I cannot spell, vault-cmd/list, you'll see it returns some stuff, right? And this is like, okay, I mean, it's always going to return like this, but if you actually investigate like some of these file paths, you'll see that there's stored credentials. I believe you can also see them in the control panel. Yeah, credential manager, Windows credentials, yeah, right here. You'll see there's like stored credentials for something, username admin. It doesn't exactly tell us the password, but that's kind of where the red teaming aspect comes in. These credentials can basically be, I guess, extracted off the image, and then you can use a master key from that's also stored on the image, and these creds can be cracked offline, which again is a security issue. So the better method of doing this would be to use like a third-party password manager of some sort, or to use like 2FA. Like don't store, or yeah, just don't store credentials on the machine. 2FA wouldn't really protect against that, but yeah, you could use something like Duo or whatever to like authenticate your like sign-in, right? Storing them on Windows natively is fine, but you have to remember that they can be cracked, so probably not entirely ideal. If you're in a very high security environment, you probably wouldn't do this. So you can go to the users directory and then go to Arthur, app data roaming, Microsoft credentials, right? And then you'll see this one right here. Something to note is that this file by default, it has no extension, but it's kind of hidden, and it's marked as an operating system file, which means even if you enable hidden files and hidden folders, you won't see this one unless you specifically tell Windows to show you operating system files. So let's go over here real quick. Users Arthur app data roaming. See, users Arthur, and then obviously we gotta show hidden folders. Yeah, app data roaming, Microsoft Vault. Is this the right one? No, Microsoft credentials. Okay, Microsoft credentials, right? And there's nothing here, even though we enabled hidden files. So what you have to do is come over here and uncheck this. Make it so Windows doesn't hide protected operating system files. Click OK, and then you'll see this, and then you can delete this. There you go. So that's how you fix that. Ideally, you wouldn't just go around like deleting credentials out of people's accounts. That may be like their only place that they're stored. But like in a workplace, you'd probably send out like an email or crack down on this, like prevent users from writing to that location, or send out like a quarterly email saying like, okay, like we're purging things from this directory. Don't store stuff here. Make sure you migrate it. Stuff like that. The next vulnerability correlated to Forensic Question 1, RDP bitmap caching. So, if you recall, RDP bitmap caching lets you actually see like pictures or like stills from an RDP session, and that can be an issue, especially when you can like read a password in that. So if you looked at the second cache that was in the directory for Forensic Question 1, the one that was like 0001, you would have seen that there's some plain text credentials exposed there. So you want to go ahead and delete that RDP bitmap cache, and you would have gotten points for this. It's not really like a very common thing, I'd say, to look for, but just the fact that there are plain text credentials that can be like exposed and read on the machine, definitely something that you don't want lingering. Alright, the next one has to do with volume shadow copies. So I kind of alluded to this one, but specifically with this vulnerability, something to note is that volume shadow copies preserve the file permissions of files that they back up. So if you look at vulnerabilities like I believe it's Hive Nightmare is what it's called. Um, that was only a vulnerability on Windows 10, but the same concept can be applied to a server, right? Um, in this case, I changed the permissions on the SAM file so that I believe like everyone or like users could read the SAM, and that's kind of bad because then you can extract hashes or things out of it and then pass the hash and whatnot, right? That's not good. So you want to go ahead and delete that because the README didn't say anything about allowing backups, and if you actually looked at the shadow copy and then like inspected the permissions, you would have seen that the permissions are like way off. Like users should not have access to that type of information. So what you want to do here is use the VSS admin command to list all shadows and then delete all of them for the C drive, and that should give you the points. Now you could just kind of gun it and delete all shadow copies without even like listing them, but I think it's good practice to just at least know what you're deleting before you just start nuking stuff. Alright, this next bit is application security, so this is probably the bit that people are most likely looking forward to. At least for me, it's the most exciting, besides like the malware stuff. So the first point just was straight out of the README. It asks you to install like Active Directory certificate services or something, and make sure that like an SSL binding was added to LDAP. So all you really had to do is just go into Server Manager, add the ADCS feature, and then like configure it with default options, and that would have created an LDAP SSL binding. So I can show that real quick. I'll let this run in the background while I explain a couple of other vulnerabilities, but basically just add roles and features. Come over here, certificate services, yep. Next, whatever, right? Certificate authority, that's fine. Perfect, that's all we need. Install. And of course, my screen dies. We'll just let it do its thing. So yeah, that's what you want to do for that. And you literally just, after it installs, it'll like ask you to configure it. You just run through the default options and you're pretty much good to go. The next vulnerability is making sure that LDAP is not anonymously accessible at certain locations, specifically the root DSE level. This is actually a STIG, so it's not too complicated, but this is something that can be used by red teamers or a threat actor to enumerate parts of your Active Directory and gain a little bit of insight. So the way you fix this is by going into ADSI edit, which if you didn't know is just kind of like an inbuilt thing you can use to like browse through LDAP. You want to change the default naming context to configuration, and then browse to this path above. So directory services, Windows NT services, configuration, or actually it's backwards, sorry. So you'd start at the liquid.local or whatever part, and then work your way down to directory services, and then right click, and there should be an option, or right click properties, and then you should see an attribute called like a DS heuristics. And I believe the 7th character here dictates like if anonymous access is enabled. I believe if it's like a 2, anonymous access is enabled. So you can set it to like all zeros, so 7 zeros, or you can just click clear and the value will like get removed and then anonymous access won't be enabled anymore. So yeah, pretty easy fix for that one. It is a little complicated to like actually solve or like figure out how to do for the first time if you've never like delved into like editing LDAP stuff, but it's really not too bad once you do it at least once. Let's see if this image is back. Alright, sweet. Close all this, don't care. Alright, we'll let this cook in the background. Alright, the next one is Elwood Preschool is no longer allowed to delegate to the domain controller DNS server. So basically for this one, you want to go back into dsa.mc, or Active Directory Users and Computers. You want to right click on the Elwood Preschool computer and go to Properties Delegation, and then delete the delegation or do not trust the computer for delegation. So if we go back here, we'll do this in a sec. let's go to DSA, and then go to computers, and where's Elwood? Preschool, right? Yeah. Properties, and then right here, if we go to delegation, we'll see that it's delegated to the, or it has delegation for DNS. Now, this can be used for different types of attacks, or exploits, I should say. More attacks. I believe this type is constrained delegation. There are also unconstrained delegation attacks. So if you check this box and it becomes unconstrained delegation, you can read about that on like some Red Team blog or whatever. It's pretty cool. But basically, this computer shouldn't have this type of delegation. So you want to remove this, or just select do not trust this computer for delegation. Either of those I believe should work. I think it's probably safer though if you just remove this first and then do not trust the computer for delegation. Alright, let's quickly go back and configure ADCS. So we click this, next, that's fine. Certificate authority, that's exactly what we wanted. It's actually the only thing we selected. Right here, enterprise CA, or standalone CA. I think we want to do enterprise because this is talking about not requiring AD, and we have AD. So do enterprise root, create new private key, whatever, right? Okay, this is fine. You can beef this up if you really want, but 2048 is fine. Next, 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 configure, and then you're done. Now LDAP should have an SSL binding. Let's see, ADSI edit, let's test this. Might have nuked the image, but let's try connecting to it. Use SSL based encryption. No idea why the image is pooping itself. Oh, of course. Might have been because I screwed with ntds.dit. Not sure. Alright, let's go back here to ADSI edit. Connect to, let's try and use SSL, don't care about focus. Okay, great, yeah. Something nuked, but ideally you should be able to check this box right here, use SSL based encryption, and it should let you connect. Or I think you might be able to do 636, which is the SSL port for LDAP. Let's try that. Yeah, okay, something is just broken on the image, not sure what. But in theory, you should be able to connect to it through that port. Alright, the next vulnerability is making sure that there's not a random pre-Windows 2000 computer account. Specifically on this image, it was once upon a restaurant. So this vulnerability actually turned out to be probably the most difficult. Partially because this wasn't an actual like computer joined to the domain. It was purely a computer account. So if you didn't know, in Active Directory you can create just like a standalone computer account. Let me show you. DSA. If you go to computers, right click, you can do new and then just create a computer, right? So this won't obviously create like a physical computer, but it creates this computer account. And you can check this box, assign this computer account as pre-Windows 2000 computer, give it all the information and create it, right? Now the issue with pre-2000 computers is that, you know, pre-2000 the security was pretty terrible, and when you create a machine account like that, or a computer account I should say, the password gets set to what the computer is named. So, you know, if you're a red teamer, you can just spray credentials with like, or use the password, or use a computer name as a password, and just spray that across the entire network, and then see if something sticks. Obviously, that's very loud and not entirely practical, but it is technically possible to get in like that. So, like I said, if it's an actual computer, it will say it's OS in this like management window. If you right click, or once upon a restaurant, if you right click properties, it should say operating system right here. But if it's just a computer account, you know, like how do you tell? How do you tell if it's pre-2000? You want to use something like Impacket to test. So you kind of have to red team yourself. I looked at this article here by TrustedSec, and it's pretty good. This person actually talks about like what type of error message you want to see um, if the account is vulnerable. But basically, you can run Impacket with SMB client, and if you get this type of error message, then you know that the computer account is using a password that's the same as its name. And in that case, you know that it's a pre-2000 computer. Another mitigation for this vulnerability could have also been just changing the password, but because scoring password changes is a little iffy, you'd have to actually like parse hashes or something, or get hashes. I decided not to go down that route, so that's why the fix for this was just deleting the computer account. It's also a STIG, I believe, to make sure that you have no pre-2000 computers in your domain. So that's another reason for scoring the deletion. Alright. The next vulnerabilities had to mainly do with DNS. So the first one is making sure that the DNS zone is Active Directory integrated. So this makes it so data is stored in Active Directory. It's better for managing permissions than having it stored in a file. And when you're replicating data, it's better if it's an AD and not just a file, because then it'll actually replicate. I believe so. Don't quote me on that though. So to actually implement this, why is this talking about DNSSEC? Oh, I put that on the wrong spot. Oh yeah, sorry. To do this, you have to do it before you implement any DNSSEC or signing, which is the next vuln. So you have to make sure your zone is unsigned. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's fine. You're actually in a good spot. So you just go here, Blakewood, right click. Actually, first make sure that it says not signed here. Then right click here, properties, and then right here where it says primary, you want to click change, and then right here, store the zone in Active Directory. Then click OK. It'll ask you want it to become Active Directory integrated. Yes, apply, OK. And now it's no longer going to store its data in a file, and it's just going to be stored in Active Directory itself. Now, this is a lot better for the reasons I previously described. And that's pretty much what the presentation will tell you here. You just check that box and then you're good to go. The next vulnerability had to do with signing. Basically just verifies the validity of the data that's being returned. Make sure that there's no man in the middle stuff going on. So this is done in a very similar way. You just go to the liquid.local zone, right click, and then DNSSEC, and you can pretty much just use the default options right here. Make sure you sign the zone, obviously. The default options are STIG compliant. Like if you go through STIGs for DNS, you'll see there's a lot of stuff about making sure that the zone is signed with like this interval and this thing, yada yada, right? If you just click next and use the defaults to sign the zone, then that should be like more than good enough. You'll see that now if you go here, it'll say that the zone is signed, and you should get points. Another thing you want to do, I don't believe you need to do this for points, but you might. To actually configure your DNS server to like validate stuff, you want to enable DNSSEC using this command right here, dnscmd/enable DNSSEC1. And then you want to retrieve root trust anchors with this other command right here. And that'll make sure that it's actually validating items. The next vulnerability has to do with disabling IPv6 to IPv4 tunneling in DNS. So you can read about it here. Another quick little Tenable or like Nessus scan report thing. Yeah, I don't really like reading those, but it's pretty useful if you're just learning. So the way you get this point is by going into the DNS server parameters under services, and then go to the global query block list. So this is basically just like a bunch of queries that are blocked by default. By default, it includes this one, this ISA tap one, but I removed it on this image. So just something to look out for, making sure that the default values are actually configured, and they're not like tampered with, because you'll see that a lot of times in misconfigured environments. It's kind of the point. So you want to include this value in there, and then make sure that you enable the query block list or set it to 1. So you can use this command right here. Or I believe you can actually just set it through registry too. Either way works. The next vulnerability, I think I alluded to a little bit, is the server level plugin DLL. I didn't score, or I didn't add a DLL myself and score the deletion of it. Instead, I decided to score logging for it. Like I talked about before, it's kind of a known privilege escalation vulnerability. It allows people to go from DNS admin all the way to system because the DNS service runs a system and the DLL gets loaded along with that. So to enable logging for something like this, you want to use this CMD, set-DNS server diagnostics, and then enable logging for plugin DLL event and then set it to true. And this will basically generate a log whenever a plugin is added or even maybe executed. So just something to look out for. In like a company scenario, you could create like custom alerts for something like this on like a centralized logging server so that you're alerted when big events happen. Yeah, just something to think about. Alright, the next vulnerability had to do with the DNS rate limiting. So this actually relates to a Microsoft like security advisory. I don't remember exactly which one. You can probably figure out if you Google it, but it can help prevent against certain denial of service vulnerabilities. As it stands on the image, there were some misconfigurations, specifically ones that would cause like overloading problems, like high CPU usage and things like that. So to fix that, first you want to either reset all the defaults or just enable rate limiting. So you can do that with this CMD alert right here, set-DNS server RRL-mode enabled, and then force. And that'll enable rate limiting. And then you want to just configure it to be the default value. So you can just add on this parameter, reset to default, and that'll fix that. And you should have gotten points for that. The second to last vulnerability is DNS protects against cache poisoning from fragmentation attacks. This is kind of like a niche vulnerability. Wasn't super publicized as far as I know. I'm not actually sure if there's even like a public proof of concept reported for this one, but you can read about it here. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you first read it. There's a lot of words being thrown around, but basically some old Linux hosts, the way they do DNS queries like could screw with the way DNS operates, could result in cache poisoning. So the recommended fix that Microsoft has proposed is to set the maximum UDP packet size to this value right here, which is, I believe it's like 1221, yeah, in decimal. So basically anything bigger than this gets returned as a TCP packet. Yeah, so use TCP for all responses larger than blah blah blah, right? And that should protect against things like this fragmentation attack that it's alluding to. So yeah, just another vulnerability that kind of like rewarded research. Obviously, if you update, shouldn't need to apply this hotfix or anything, but wanted to reward people who do the kind of like hard digging and learn about these things. It's also pretty interesting to read about. Google Chrome browser syncing is disabled. This was the final vulnerability on the image, and unfortunately the only vulnerability or scored vulnerability for Google Chrome. So this one was actually set through the registry, not through any of like the Google Chrome preferences, like in the GUI. I don't think you can even set it through the GUI, to be honest. This is a STIG, I believe, and if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? Syncing in a lot of modern day browsers lets you sync a lot, more than just like a theme or something. You'll end up syncing like settings, bookmarks, extensions, and those are all things that an organization or enterprise would want to monitor and control. So being able to sync software would potentially allow users to put a lot of like non-work compliant things onto a work machine, and that could open a bunch of other loopholes. You know, there've been a lot of reports of like malicious extensions in Mozilla or Chrome and whatnot, and you really don't know until you kind of like dive into the source code, right? So it's better to just prevent users from being able to do that in the first place by setting this policy, and that way you won't have to run into issues like that. Alright, I think that's pretty much it for the vulnerabilities. Thank you for doing the image if you did participate. I hope you at least learned something out of it, or even if you didn't do it and just watch a tutorial video, this little walkthrough here, hopefully you got something out of it. I know it's pretty long, looking at like an hour and 54 minutes. Um, but yeah, this presentation will also get dropped separately, so you know you don't have to watch the whole video. But if you're here, obviously you have. Uh, Always feel free to message me on Discord. I try my best to respond to people. Sometimes if I get flooded, I'll forget. Um, but usually I try my best. And then my Twitter's there too, you know, if you want to hit me up any chance. Yeah, have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.